right, so the last area that we're going to look at in the nervous system before we move on is going to be the autonomic nervous system. So really when we've talked about the nervous system so far, we've generally talked about the voluntary nervous system where you have conscious control, skeletal muscle, you have a neuron that's going from the central nervous system out to the other area, and these are always exciting and all controlled by the cerebellum. Excuse me, the cerebrum. Where the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, it is controlling smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and different glands, stuff that you're not aware of. We're going to see that there is usually a two-step neuron process, at least on these ones. And again, we're going to have some different neurotransmitters and that can be both excitatory and inhibitory. And this is going to be mainly regulated by the hypothalamus, which is controlling a lot of your autonomic nervous system. So again, the somatic nervous system, neuron from the central nervous system releasing the acetylcholine to skeletal muscles or a few other different things. Where the autonomic nervous system, we're going to have two subdivisions that we've talked about before, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. But really, there's going to be a couple different neurotransmitters taking place here, norepinephrine, as well as acetylcholine again. And again, we're going to talk about each of these a little bit more. Sympathetic, a lot of times is referred to as the fight or flight or E division. These things that if you were to have to fight something off, you might be having to deal with this. Things like increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, stuff that happens when you exercise, when you're excited, when you're embarrassed. Where the parasympathetic, these are going to be activities that are upregulated when you're resting or digesting. So things like digestion, urination, defecation. And again, mainly going to be two different systems that we're going to talk about here that have some similarities but also some differences. These tend to work in opposite directions of one another. So usually something that the sympathetic system might upregulate, generally the parasympathetic is going to downregulate that. So an example of influencing heart rate, sympathetic tends to increase heart rate, parasympathetic tends to decrease heart rate. That being said, sympathetic would tend to decrease digestive activity where parasympathetic would increase it. So don't get in your head that the one is always excitatory and the other one's always inhibitory. Generally stuff is duly innervated. There is certain blood vessels, certain sweat glands that are only innervated by the sympathetic, and it's really an on-off type of thing. The other thing is there is a exception to the rule that they're antagonistic, and that is male and female sexual response. You need parasympathetic for kind of sexual excitement and erection, where sympathetic is needed to have orgasm. And that is the one area where they tend to work together. Both of these are going to have a ganglion synapse that's in there. So we're going to have a ganglion, again, remember, is a group of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. What this means is there's going to be a synapse in this ganglion. So we're always going to have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. How long these are and where they're originating from is going to be a little different, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. But this preganglionic neuron is always going to go to a ganglion, have a synapse there. There might be a certain type of, this neurotransmitter is going to be a certain type here where, depending on sympathetic versus parasympathetic, you might have a different neurotransmitter out here on the postganglionic neuron going to the target cell or tissue. What we end up seeing is sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Where these originate is a little bit different. So for the sympathetic nervous system, you're really going to have branches of the sympathetic nervous system leaving the central nervous system along the spinal cord from about T1 to L2, where when we look at the parasympathetic, it's really going to be off of the brainstem as part of the vagus, as well as down in the sacral region. So they kind of refer to that one as cranial sacral. Another difference that we see is the ganglion in the sympathetic nervous system, because we tend to mass activate the sympathetic nervous system, because generally fight or flight, you don't want to just increase heart rate, but you want to also increase breathing rate and a number of other things. We tend to see the ganglion much closer to the central nervous system. So these are what we call paravertebrals. So they're right next to the vertebrae in a chain. We kind of saw that when we were looking at the spinal nerves when I did that last one. Where when you look at the parasympathetic, they tend to have the ganglion very close to the target tissue. because of this, you have a short preganglionic fiber and a long postganglionic fiber in the sympathetic nervous system, and we actually see the opposite because the preganglionic fiber is going almost all the way to the target tissue, going to the ganglion there, and then you have a short connection when you're talking about parasympathetic. And this kind of shows you the branching and some of the ideas on this one. So you can see the parasympathetic is, again, mainly coming off of cranial nerves. So you can see some going to the eye, some going to the salivary glands. This is actually the vagus nerve doing a lot of this. And then the other branches are off of the sacrum down there, where you can see T1 to L2 is where you're really seeing all these coming out. And this is showing the ganglion being very close to the vertebrae right there, and not having the ganglion right at the organ, which we see in the parasympathetic. So again, you can see the shorter versus longer here. One of the things that's interesting in both of these, they are going to have acetylcholine being released at the ganglion synapse right here in both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And you're going to see these same type of receptors that we're going to talk about in just a minute there, these cholinergic nicotinic receptors. What you see a little bit different is when we get to the parasympathetic nervous system at the ganglion, it's again going to use acetylcholine there, but you might have a muscarinic or a nicotinic receptor, where in the case of the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to use norepinephrine, and we're going to have these adrenergic receptors, either alpha or beta. And when it comes to the autonomic system, the hypothalamus is really the main region in charge of this. It is going to have centers in there that directly connect to this, in some cases through that limbic system for the fight or flight. And it's kind of talking about the amygdala and some of the other gray matter that allows us to respond to some of these fear responses. One of the things that's kind of interesting on these ones is we do have these tables where we see these different actions in this. So this next little bit here is I have a few tables. I don't want you to memorize all this. Just have a basic idea on some of the activities here. Later on actually is the table. If somehow that slide got moved, sorry about that. But the sympathetic, again, craniosacral, thoracolumbar for the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic being, like I said, that craniosacral. We talked about each one of these, how they're a little bit longer, and where the ganglion is closer to the target organ in the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic is closer to the spinal cord. Like I said, generally the parasympathetic, you're not getting this mass activation. Because of that, it's usually a more local response because we have a lot longer preganglionic fibers. There's not a lot of branching before that, where with the sympathetic nervous system, it's a lot more mass activation. So the branching is much closer to the central nervous system, and we are going to see a lot of organs all activated together in response to a sympathetic response. So, and again, that's what they're saying here. Most of these you're activating together. So generally, you don't want to just increase heart rate without increasing breathing rate and pupil dilation if we're having a response to, like, again, a fight or flight response. You want to activate a lot of this together. And again, the neurotransmitters are really going to be acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And again, depending on the receptor subtypes, they can stimulate or inhibit. In these cases here, we're going to see in certain cases, it's the receptor can actually bring about completely opposite responses based on the neurotransmitter, what the receptor is. So, and again, this is showing you some of that branching on these ones here. So you can see the vagus nerve is CNX, that's cranial nerve 10. You can see there are some plexuses that are going to each of these here, but you can see it's really only the vagus nerve that has a little bit more mass activation going on, where almost everything else, there is not much of a branching taking place. The sympathetic trunk's a lot more branching in there. These almost look like a little string of pearls next to the spinal cord. A lot of times we talk about this as a sympathetic trunk ganglia. And that's where these ganglionic bodies are at. And you're going to have them subdivided into kind of a superior, middle, and inferior portions here. But you can see the spinal cord would be right here. This is that sympathetic chain ganglia right here, right next to the spinal cord, that paravertebral area. Acetylcholine is going to be the main neurotransmitter in this. It is going to be at all the ganglionic neurons, as well as at the postganglionic synapse in the parasympathetic nervous system. This binds to what we call cholinergic receptors. And we're going to see that there is 2 types of these. Norepinephrine, on the other hand, binds to adrenergic receptors. Another name for norepinephrine is noradrenaline, epinephrine, adrenaline. So that's where we get the adrenergic receptor. And again, these are going to be at the target organ. The synapse at the target organ is going to be releasing the norepinephrine, binding to the adrenergic receptors on the target organ. And this is again showing you kind of some of this idea of this release and these varicosities that can release a lot of this norepinephrine at once. So which neurons are cholinergic and which are adrenergic? Cholinergic are going to be all the pre-ganglionic connecting to the post-ganglionic neuron. And so at the ganglion, all those synapses are going to release acetylcholine there. All parasympathetic target neurons are going to release acetylcholine, where the only place we're going to see adrenergic or adrenaline being released, norepinephrine, is going to be at the target synapse of the sympathetic nervous system. And as we were saying, there is 2 main types of cholinergic receptors. We are going to have what we call nicotinic receptors, and these get their names more so from other chemicals that can activate them. So nicotinic receptors respond to the drug nicotine. So they named it that. So these are found, like I said, in all the ganglionic neurons. And when the acetylcholine binds to those, it's going to allow greater movement of sodium into the cell and potassium out, which means these are always going to be an excitatory response, going to produce a stimulation. So in the case of that ganglionic neuron, it's always going to activate the next neuron in that chain. The other type is muscarinic receptors. They respond to a toxin called muscarine. It comes from poisonous mushrooms. That's where it got its name. These, again, found in target membranes in the parasympathetic division, in certain sympathetic cells as well. These ones, there is some different subtypes. They can either be stimulatory and inhibitory, and we're not going to get into which ones are and when and why, but a binding of acetylcholine in the GI tract results in a stimulation where, again, binding at the heart is actually going to lead to a decrease in heartbeat. So those are the 2 different subtypes of muscarinic receptors, that given examples of each. So the nicotinic, like I said, always in the ganglion. The muscarinic receptors are always going to be at the target organ and in very few sympathetic target cells. What neurotransmitter binds to a nicotinic receptor? It is going to be acetylcholine, and it's always going to be stimulatory on that one. So what we will talk about in the second half of this is we are going to look a little bit more at actions, as well as we're going to talk a little bit about the adrenergic receptors and what's going on with those. So I will talk to you next time.